Welcome to another edition of News in Depth here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Europe's push for defense integration is accelerating, from joint arms procurement to calls for a unified military force. But sovereignty concerns, NATO tensions, and UK re-engagement efforts complicate the picture. Joining us today on TVP World to unpack this is Steward Dowell, a political editor at TVP World and EU affairs expert. Hello and welcome to News in Depth.
Hi, Ben.
So we are looking at this Brussels' growing role in defense spending, and can you help us understand what this planning tells us about the direction of EU's political authority?
Where's it heading? Well, the idea there are two ideas on the table at the moment. The European Union Defence Commissioner Andrius Kubilius proposed a big bang in European defence thinking. He wanted to blue sky the whole thing, 100,000 soldier army for Europe, a huge, crossing a huge red line for a lot of member states in terms of sovereign defence sovereignty. That idea was met with a response by Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, who proposed a European Legion, a much smaller brigade size force, brigade size meaning anything from 10 to 8,000, a few thousand soldiers, but it would be different from arrangements that we currently have in the EU, because there are some. This would be an actual force under the authority of the EU to be used how the EU wants. It wouldn't require national approval. The soldiers would be voluntary. That's the important thing. And this was kind of like a middle way.
Right, like you mentioned, there's some what a lot of people would consider a red line for this Big Bang sort of approach proposed by Kubilius. But can you help us understand why has this military integration, why has this idea triggered so much political resistance as opposed to things like trade or economy?
Well, defence is, like I said, one of the last red lines. The national sovereign states have a monopoly on violence. That means a monopoly on how to use their army to commit violence against another force. Of course, for good reasons, one would hope, but also a monopoly in how to decide under what circumstances you can put your own people under the threat of violence, and that's surely a big red line.
Right, definitely. With a lot of more increasingly Eurosceptic members in the European Union as well, talking about like economic measures or political measures having already been used as leverage against individual countries. I can understand why some countries will feel a little bit worried about this development. But we also have the proposal by the Polish foreign minister that you mentioned earlier. We have the soundbite right here. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
I think it is pointless to talk about a federal army because it is unrealistic, because there will be no merging of national armies. On the other hand, we could create, I call it the European Legion. This is already in the European Parliament's resolutions. For a start, it would be a brigade-sized unit in which citizens of the member states and perhaps candidate countries could enroll, in which the rules for the use of arms were agreed, which would be politically subordinate to the Security and Foreign Affairs Council, and which would be financed from the European budget. That would not be a force capable of deterring Putin, but there are lower-level dangers, such as in North Africa or the Balkans, where we should have the capacity to act collectively. And I think this deteriorating international security situation around Europe makes this idea more urgent than ever.
I think either way you look at it, there are pros and cons of various different approach. And in the foreign minister's suggestion, he himself laid out the limitations of this idea that, well, it wouldn't be able to deter threats such as Vladimir Putin, which would assume is why we're having this conversation in the first place. But prior to discussing the defense, you also mentioned, and in one of your articles, talked about how EU has always accelerated through crisis. But can you help us understand, like, how do we get here in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. I think the European Union is almost by design centralises through various crises that have happened through its history. And it was even predicted by one of the early political scientists, a guy called Ernst Haas in the 1950s, said that European Union will grow and centralise through crises. And we saw that, for example, after the single market, the European needed its own currency to make sense of the single market. That wasn't exactly a crisis, but what came after it was with the euro crisis around 2008, 2010. So in order to prevent an economic meltdown, the European Union member states were happy to adopt a whole range of fiscal supervision measures that were, and of course, once those measures are adopted to avert one crisis, they just stay. And that means, for example, that governments have to submit their budget annually to the European Union for approval. That's quite a big step. And also, governments can't go above 3% in terms of fiscal deficit, and there are penalties and all sorts of procedures in countries that do that. And then, of course, we saw in the COVID, in the pandemic, that introduced, crossed another red line of government of EU collective borrowing, and Kubilius is talking about another big step in a defence union. But I would argue that the European Union has already had its big bang moment. In terms of defence, and that is becoming kind of looking after the back office of defence, I would say, in the way that it organises defence financing, defence procurement, what kind of equipment can be bought, from where, and this. A lot of this is contained within SAFE, the Security Action for Europe, the 150 billion euro loan arrangement that countries can take advantage of. But if they do, like Poland is going to take, I think, 47 billion euros, but it comes with a lot of strings. In any defence contract, 65% of the spending has to be on components that come from Europe. Only 35% can come from outside of Europe. And also they have to buy equipment that can then later be modified by those European countries that own it. So the idea is that a foreign power, let's say the United States, can't just say you can't use this anymore, some kind of kill switch. So the European Union is really centralising, at least at the moment, some part of nation states' defence budgets, and saying what they can spend it on, because in order to qualify for these loans, it has to be on equipment that comes under a priority that the European Union has already determined. So on what they spend it, where they spend it. Yes, I would argue that this big bang in defence has already happened.
Right. But like I mentioned, a lot of these changes were made out of necessity, and right now the necessity would be to establish enough deterrence. Do you think that's already been has already taken place is enough?
Enough deterrence? I think people have different views on this. If you look at the words of Kallas, I think we're going to hear from her later. She. Her point is that having a European army, in the way that Kubilius is describing, would blur the lines.
Right. Actually, on that, let's actually take a look at what she had to say.
We are all well aware of the political issues that have limited cooperation, but especially now, as the US setting its sights abroad and beyond Europe, NATO needs to become more European to maintain its strength, and for that, Europe must act. For example, we need to ensure that our security and defence initiatives remain complementary to NATO. For this, the ball is also in NATO's court. If we want to use EU instruments, such as our budgetary and regulatory power, to support and enable NATO, we have to know what these needs and targets are.
So traditionally, Estonia is quite hawkish when it comes to defense, but in this statement, Kallas seems to be still sticking more strongly to NATO as a defense union. Do you think that is more out of military necessity, or is it a more political decision?
Certainly out of military necessity. You're right. Kallas is known as a European defence hawk, and it's kind of interesting that she's shying away from the idea of a European army. You might think it would be the other way around, but let's compare it with what Kubilius said. He complained or suggested that that Europe was a kind of a forest of bonsai trees in terms of armies, these little small, perfectly formed armies. But of course they need to be taken together and create one big army. And the reason he said that is we know that those small bonsai armies create parallel structures. And I think Kallas's concern is that creating a European army also creates another parallel structure. So we have two there.
Yeah, that is quite paradoxical, like you mentioned, even though trying to streamline European defense might unify it within Europe, that might actually create a two-track system with NATO. It's really hard to gauge how to go forward. And speaking of Kubilius, he's also mentioned nuclear weapon capabilities. According to him, he said, and I quote, EDA annual conference to be ready together now and tomorrow, delivering on European defense readiness of 2030. Do you think that nuclear would also be something that Europe tries to pursue as well?
There's no real serious indication that Europe's trying to increase its nuclear capabilities or change. It wants to maintain the American nuclear security guarantee. I think that also Kubilius, we should remember that Kubilius's suggestions were made at a conference. These are not official European proposals, are not part of an agenda at the European Council. But on the other hand, Kubilius is a defence commissioner, and these are his views, and he said them. So I think it kind of more shows the direction of travel, the way of thinking at the moment. In the same way that Sikorski's comments are also not an official proposal from the Polish government, but something along those lines. Yeah.
Right. It does showcase all the nuances and how to coordinate defense going forward. And I think you mentioned very rightfully that Europe is in a kind of a trial, and it is time that these are all being considered how to go forward. And in the meantime, another country, being the UK, is also trying to be within the European defense's umbrella as well. Recently, we saw Starmer push for a re-engagement with EU defense structures. What does that reveal about how he sees British role in Europe?
How does he see it? I think that Keir Starmer, the British government, wants to engage with the SAFE programme, Security Action for Europe, but not to borrow money, of course, but to be one of the providers of all the defence kit that's going to be bought. I mean, why wouldn't it? There's 150 billion euros that's going to go on defence kit, and because Europe's outside the European Union, it only gets access to 35% of any order. It wants to be on the inside, so it can get more. It tried last year, but it was asked to pay, I believe, up to 2 billion euros in a kind of pay-for-play deal. Pay for access. The government thought that was too much. It thought something in the hundreds of millions. I think, what does this say about Britain? That it underlines that it's still suffering from Brexit. It's looking for any kind of trade opportunities. Its defence industry is one of the few sectors where it actually does well in the sale of goods, because it's a service-based economy. 80% of its economy is in services, only 20% in goods. So of course it needs access to the European market.
So do you see this as more of a pragmatic decision due to a more economic perspective, or is there also other renewed interest when it comes to joint cooperation in terms of defense and deterrence?
I think that think that Britain has already made strong moves in geopolitically since it left Brexit, since it left the European Union, and particularly with the Joint Expeditionary Force in the northern flank, the Baltic countries. This really gives Britain, seeing the difficulty it was in 2020-21 when it left the European Union, kind of created a mini NATO, we can call it, in the north, and it keeps its influence in Europe. But of course, in defence isn't the European Union. Britain can be involved in defence issues. Its main problem is in economy and trade and in services particularly.
Do you think that this could, like defense, could be a testing ground for rebuilding political ties between the EU and UK without having to open that box of Brexit?
I think that Britain is in a difficult position. It was in a difficult position in 2016. It can't sell its services the way it wants to in the European Union. It created a deficit every year, but selling its services in the rest of the world has proved to be not that easy. This is a deal we're talking about. Safe is in goods. That's important, but services are the most important part of the British economy. And if it wants to correct the course on Brexit or do something about that, rejoining or re-engaging with Europe without getting access to Europe's large services market is a half-cocked measure.
Right. We also do have Starmer's statement about increased cooperation with the EU as well from earlier this year. So let's take a look.
Mm-hmm. I've always been clear that we need a closer relationship with the EU. That is in our national interest. And we've taken important steps towards that with the EU-UK reset. And it is a reset. Mm-hmm. Relations between the UK and the EU are in the best position they've been for 10 years.
Do you believe from the EU's perspective, has the political move shifted enough to welcome the UK back into defence talks or even trade, economic talk in new terms?
I think that the fundamental EU position and the reason why there was an economic logic to leave. I'm not saying it was the reason why Britain left. People voted for many different reasons, from identity to migration. But the economic arguments, the European Union hasn't changed on that. And if Britain is going to re-engage or have a reset, Europe is going to apply a very heavy cost. Even in this safe issue, we've seen that they're asking for $2 billion just to have the right to tender for contracts. So any other kind of reset is going to be very, very expensive. Europe will make Britain pay for it.
Right. Now, there's this common idea that recent visit of Mark Carney to China and the re-engagement in trade has to do with Trump's aggressive action pushing them towards China. Do you think that the same argument could be made that Starmer is also cozying up to China in terms of trade because of the lack of opportunity within Europe itself?
Yes, Britain is looking for trade deals all around the world, and it's already signed a few. But these are the thing with trade is that if you double the distance away from your border, you half the trade. That's the rule of thumb. So even though these economies in Vietnam and Indonesia and places look like they're very attractive economies, they're just simply too far away to plug the goods gap. And anyway, plugging the goods gap is only a fraction of Britain's problems because it wants to be able to sell its services. In fact, there was some talk on services with China on pharmaceuticals in terms of the registration and selling pharmaceuticals using Britain as a regulatory kind of base for that. And that's very encouraging.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us unpack all that in News in Depth. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of News in Depth. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.